to Geoff Henderson. Geoff has been, I'm sure many of you know, as well as I do, Geoff has been a member of Porthcawl U3A for over 15 years and is now a joint convener of the computer group. He started his working life with the Steel Company of Wales at Port Talbot and led the team that developed the world's first real-time computer system. In the mid-1970s, he joined IBM and retired 25 years later as sales director. He has since become an amateur historian. Today, he's going to talk about the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable, a project driven to an eventually successful conclusion by the vision and sheer obstinacy of one man. I particularly am very interested in this because it's only 10 months since I was on Cable Beach on the western side of Australia on my holiday last year. So welcome, Geoff.
Thank you, Sally. I can hear. Can everyone hear? Thank you. Well, my topic is the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable. And as Sally said in her introduction, this is down to the drive and initiative at the time of one man. And I've long believed that individuals can change things. And if you've got someone who's really determined to have a crack at something, even one individual, you can change the world. And I think this man did. So I'll start in 1815, which is a long time before the cable went in. And you might say, well, this is rather a sad tale. 5,500 Brits attacking 4,500 Americans. This is part of the War of 1812. And it was the last battle of the War of 1812. And in no time, about 30 minutes, 2,000 British casualties. The Americans were really well entrenched, defended well, and that was the result. Now you could say, well, that's sad, it's a disaster, it's a military disaster, and it's very sad. And it is indeed. And what makes it even sadder is that 2 weeks earlier, the peace treaty between America and the United Kingdom was signed in Ghent. But they hadn't got the news to America. And why? Well, the fastest crossing of the Atlantic at the time was made in about 6 weeks. And typically, it would take 16. And depending on the time of year, it could take even longer, but never shorter. There was a clear need to speed up communication, not just around the world, but everywhere. Particularly in times of war, you've got governments in capitals trying to direct wars in far-flung places, but the meantime, to get information and instructions and find out what was going on, could be 3 months. Not a smart way to run anything, really. In 1819, there was a huge improvement. They managed to do the fastest crossing in 27 days. Still wouldn't have solved the problem of the battle at New Orleans. And people were experimenting with all sorts of things, from carrier pigeons. I think this is one of the Porthcawl town pigeons. Don't feed them, please. Semaphore. This was part of a network that Napoleon had built across France. That only works in daylight and in good visibility. Doesn't work otherwise. But in 1745, Sir William Watson discovered that you could send electricity quite some distance down a copper wire. And that proved to be quite a promising technology that a number of inventors then started working on. And in 1840, it was transformed by Samuel Morse, who invented Morse code. And that was a huge step forward in communication. And the 1840s was an interesting time. What does Confucius say? We live in interesting times. So did these chaps. An amazing decade, really. everything going on everywhere. And a lot of this could be time-sensitive information relating to these things could be really, really handy. So technology was beginning to march, science was beginning to come into things. And globalization was beginning. International trade was booming. And trade is very, very important, obviously. And with trade comes finance, and with finance comes financial speculation, where time is absolutely of the essence. So Morse and his telegraph wires spread around. Within 10 years, telegraph wires connected every part of America. And within a year, they were taking cables underwater. And that was a huge leap forward. The first one was 1851 between Holyhead and Ireland. One was put across the English Channel, and a fishing boat caught something in its net, pulled it up and thought, oh, that looks nice, I'll pinch that. So they just cut a piece out. So they were prone. Copper looks expensive, and it is expensive. So there are all sorts of problems putting stuff underwater, including insulation. But technology and communication was important enough that in every country in the world where these things went in, they were nationalized. The networks became nationalized. Like I remember our old GPO, in 1964, if you wanted a phone, you waited 6 months for it or something. The only place that went private enterprise for the telegraph network was America. So the land of the free and the capitalist world. Everyone else nationalized it. It was too important to let private individuals run these things. And then along came a latex called gutta percha, which is a bit like rubber. It's a fabulous insulator. And the only difference between it and rubber, it's processed the same way. You cut an incision in the bark of a tree and you tap the latex out. The difference between this and rubber is that gutta percha, when you cut the bark, kills the tree. So you've got to constantly replant, whereas for rubber you can tap it, and tap it. And its virtue is it's biologically inert, which is to say that nothing living is interested in it. So animals don't nibble at it, and plants don't have a go at it. You can put it in the ground, you can put it underwater. It's a fabulous insulator. It's watertight, airtight, it's everything type. So it's brilliant. And when it was first discovered, it was used for these things. Bottle stoppers, golf balls. The reason the dimples were able to be put into golf balls was because of the material it was made from. And Faraday and others were experimenting with copper wire and beginning to worry about how to insulate it, how to stop the electrical signal in it just evaporating off somewhere else, being short-circuited. And the Dover-Calais one went in 1851, and that worked until the fishing boats came along. So within 10 years, Europe is very well covered. There are telegraph lines all over Europe. America is completely covered. The challenge is, how do you connect these two hotspots of Europe, which is the industrialized Europe, and the developing America, and the need to connect those two. And in 1850, the point at which there wasn't yet a working underwater cable, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Newfoundland, who was an interesting man, had an idea. He thought, I know what we can do to shorten the time to get information from the east to the west. We'll run a cable, because we've got cables everywhere, from New York to St. John's. St. John's is the nearest point to Europe on the North American continent. 1,200 miles, so we can get information across there at the same speed as we used to, but then the next 1,200 miles, we can whack it down a wire and it'll be in New York 3 weeks sooner than it would otherwise. Terrific idea. And he found a man to do it, Frederick Gisborne, from Preston. And he thought this was a terrific idea. This is the bloke, by the way, who'd put electrical wires, he'd put electrical cables into Manchester. So he was something of a scientist, something of a technologist, and certainly was keen to have a crack at something. And he laid the first underwater cable in North America from Nova Scotia up to Newfoundland across the strait, 360 miles. And the cable was about the size of my little finger and your little finger. So it was just a single wire with some gutta percha around it. Very simple technology. There it is. And then what he wants to do is lay the cable from there to St. John's, which is this point. But after 40 miles, the terrain is unforgiving. After 40 miles, he's run out of cash and he's bankrupt. He's not a man to give in, so he has another crack at raising some money and gets a bit further, but still runs out of cash. And not only was this a tough terrain, it still is. There is still no road along the south of Newfoundland. If you want to get to St. John's, which is here, this is the road. So nothing crosses this bit of Newfoundland. At this point, enter our hero, Cyrus Westfield. Now he looks a gentle sort of character. One of 8 sons of a preacher, a super smart family. He and his father and 4 of his sons are mentioned in the American Dictionary of Biography, the Dictionary of American Biography. And that's a bit like the who's who of America at the time. He's smart as well. He was apprenticed to the man who invented department stores, where he did very well. He worked in the accounts department, and he was smart with money. And they initiated a bonus scheme. The owner of the business put this bonus scheme in place. And depending on what happened, different bonuses were put in the pot. But he didn't lay down any rules for what to do with the bonus. And Cyrus decided it would be a jolly good idea if him and his chums in the office had a blowout night on the town, which is what they did. And when Mr. Field founded, no relation, founded the department store, discovered this, Cyrus explained to him, well, you didn't say there were any rules, so we thought it'd be a good thing to do. And he said, well, fair enough then. And off he went. He joined a paper business in 1837, which went bust. And he bought the business from the administrators for 30 cents on the dollar, which is he paid about a third to buy the business from the administrators of what it had previously been worth. Nothing wrong with that, entirely legal. The administrators thought that was a good deal. And he had enough money to do that. It cost him about $200,000 at the time. But by 1852, he'd made a real success of the business. And he'd repaid the 70 cents, or not repaid. The people he bought it from at 30 cents, he gave them the other 70. He'd made a success of the business, and he gave them the money, which built his reputation and lasted him all his life. 1852, he's 34, he decides to retire and travel. And he travels all over the place, and the people who carried him in carriages and whatever, the one thing they remember about him was whenever he was going anywhere, he'd shout from the back, faster, faster, can't you go faster? I want to see more. And that's the reputation of this man, but he's bored. He's seen enough travel and he's done enough, and now he's bored. And this is the point at which he's introduced to Frederick Gisborne, who had gone bust, but had this idea, was pushing the idea from the Bishop of Newfoundland. America, desperate for capital because it's trying to expand. The capital market, the biggest capital market in the world is London. You want money, London is the place to go for it. Benjamin Franklin had said 100 years earlier, time is money. And if you want any proof of that, I offer you my favorite cartoonist. An American cartoonist, and he's wonderful with animals and people. But he proves it, this formula proves it. Time equals money. And Cyrus's leap, when he met Gisborne and understood the significance of it, was, well, this is pretty straightforward, and we don't muck about waiting for boats to cross the Atlantic. We lay a cable across the Atlantic. Now, that's equivalent to someone of our generation saying, we all remember when Sputnik was launched, right? If one of us then had said, okay, this means we can land on Mars, we can land on Mars, that's the size of this leap. We're still not on Mars. But technologically, that would be the equivalent of Cyrus's leap, let's lay a cable across the Atlantic. He spoke to Samuel Morse about it, and Morse said, no reason why that can't be possible. Technology can do it. But neither of them understood the extent of the challenge that they faced in doing this. Another man that Cyrus met was Lieutenant Maury, who had just finished a survey of the seabed for the Department of the Navy. And Cyrus met him and said, can you do this for us? And he said, well, singularly enough, I've just been talking to the Secretary of the Navy about it, and here it is. And it's perfect for laying cable. It hasn't got chasms and gorges and all this sort of stuff. It's relatively flat, and it's broken seashells and sand and whatever. So it's a nice benign environment in which to lay cable. So Cyrus persuades a bundle of people, some of the wealthiest people in New York, to invest in financing the cable. One of whom was Morse. Morse is this chap here. And this is Cyrus. So he put some money in himself, and they raised $1.5 million. Now, that's a sizable amount of money today, but just to put it into context, that's about 2% of the total American budget at the time. The government budget was $58 million, and these guys raised 1.5 to spend on this venture. So he's a persuasive salesman, is our Cyrus. And he doesn't take no for an answer from anybody, and of course, and he's putting his own money in. So they have a 3-phase plan. We'll go out to St. John's, and then we'll get to Newfoundland, we'll go to St. John's, and then we'll cross the Atlantic. Pretty straightforward. They have to use, gutta percha is what they're going to use to insulate it, and that has to come from Britain because Britain has the monopoly. So the cable is made in England. They get 85 miles across the Cabot Strait, which is this bit, and the captain who's laying the cable panicked because the boat was pitching and he was afraid that the weight of the cable would take the ship down, so he cut the cable, and they had to start again. They had another go the following year, still didn't succeed, and they ran out of cash. So what Cyrus do at this point, he's still got his investors on board from America, but they've lost the $1.5 million. So the place he's got to go to raise capital now is London. If you want capital, that's the place to do it. Limited companies were a British innovation. That's where the investors are not responsible, are not liable. They're liable for the shares that they buy in the company. And the company raised money. He's very persuasive. He's got a good track record. People like him. He persuades the government, the British government, to put in 140,000. And he persuades the American government to do the same because they can see some advantage themselves of having good communications. The Astronomer Royal at the time tried to pour cold water on the idea because he said, well, technologically, it's just not possible. You put a cable at the bottom of the Atlantic, it's so deep, the water pressure is so high that it will crush the cable. Didn't happen, of course. But Astronomers Royal don't have a particularly good track record in this point. Only 21 months before Sputnik was launched, the Astronomer Royal said, space travel is bilge. So they should stick to what they know, looking at the stars. So he raises the money, orders the cable, 340,000 miles of copper wire, 300 tons of gutta percha. He's got 2 ships, I'll show you them in a second, one British ship, one American ship, and he's got a letter from Queen Victoria to President Buchanan. The survey is done by a gentleman called Charles Bright, who goes around Western Ireland and decides where's the best place to bring this cable, to run the cable from, to head off across. And Valentia Bay was the place they chose. Nice, gently sloping beach off into the water. And naturally enough, there's got to be a Welsh connection, isn't there? If you pardon the pun. But it comes, the wire, traditional telegraph wire across Ireland, and it goes underwater again to Abermawr near Porthcawl. And that's only a couple of miles, not even a couple of miles, a couple of 100 yards from Great Western Railway's railway line, where there's wires running all the way to London. And that's the first connection with Brunel. And these are the two ships. No ship was big enough to hold all the cable, so it was decided to split it across two. 2,500 tons of it, so there's 1,250 tons in each. Niagara, the American ship, was probably the largest warship in the world at the time. Both ships had engines, that was essential, but they also had sails. And the big debate was, where do you start? There were two schools of thought. One was, sail both ships to the center of the Atlantic, connect the two wires together, and then each ship does that. Or you could start in Ireland and lay the cable out, and then when you're about to run out of cable, you join them together and the other ship carries on. And in a piece of international cooperation that we might never get under the Trump, the American ship started from the Irish end with an American crew, and the British ship took over in the middle and took it to America. That was the plan. And they thought, well, if we start in Ireland, as we're laying the cable out, we can test the circuit all the time, make sure that everything's working. So that's what they did. The stuff where the cable was made in London because of the gutta-percha monopoly. It took 30 men a month to load the cable onto each ship. Huge job. And off they go in 1857. They get 5 miles and they lose the signal, so they cut the cable and they go back and start again. And they keep doing this. They get 100 miles and something else happens and they go back and start again. And they get 385 miles and they go back and start again. But they're learning a lot about the technology of this, and the key thing they're discovering is the running gear on the ship, the thing that the cable comes out of the hold, runs over a big wheel into the water, how you manage that. And you imagine you're dropping cable down, it's not very heavy, but it's heavy enough, and you're dropping it down maybe a mile deep or 2 miles deep. There's a hell of a drag on the boat. A lot of things to learn here. At one point, Field jumps out of his bunk on the ship because he hears this wheel running loose. And he runs down and tries to apply the brake. Doesn't work and the cable snaps. So they're learning a lot in doing this. It's a tough thing to have a crack at. Anyway, they give up in 1857, and Field & Co., which is what the company is called, is now bust, and it owes $600,000 to its debtors. So what's he do now? Well, I tell you what he doesn't do. He doesn't give in. And in 1858, with a new 2,500 tons of cable, off they go again. They started in the middle this time and did it that way. They hit really severe storms, and they were troubled by curious whales. Now they're running this wire down the back of the boat over the wheel there. The last thing you want is a whale bumping into that. It would go like that. And they've constructed this sort of, they called it a girdle around the back of the ship to stop anything, keep it away from the propeller, but it's difficult to keep it away from whales. But anyway, it worked. And they get to America, and they are successful. Huge celebrations. The Queen sent President Buchanan a message, glory to God in the highest, on earth, peace to all men. And America went nuts, right? If you thought they went nuts over the Meghan Markle marriage, this pales it into insignificance. The President replied by telegraph. First commercial message, news. You know, the King of Prussia isn't well. I'm sure everyone in America wanted to know that. And the settlement of the Chinese question, which had been troubling diplomats around the world about whether diplomats had to kowtow to the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor decided, well, perhaps it's okay, as long as you're an emissary of a crowned head, you're okay. So it was important stuff. And there was an insatiable demand for news. Think about it this time. I don't know how many newspapers there would be in America at this point, but probably every town had one and every state would have had one. They've never had national newspapers like we have, but newspaper readership was at huge circulations, and people were desperate. Think how many people in America had come from Europe, desperate for news about America. There was a ready market for news. And there were posters, there were maps, all sorts of gizmos and all sorts of stuff that people were selling to celebrate this enormous technological achievement. You could even have a slice of the cable set as a charm, and you could wear it around your neck. Or you could have it in a ring. Remember, it's only the size of a little finger. The man who, Mr. Bright, who did the survey and all the rest of it, he was made a lord, and Queen Victoria was keen on the idea of making Cyrus a lord, but she couldn't do it because he was an American citizen. And there was even a dance, the Telegraph cable polka. So if there's a musician here, we've got a keyboard, I'll find the music and you can play it. So 400 messages traveling back and forth in no time. One message alone saved the UK government. If you remember, put 140,000 into this. It saved the government £60,000 because the government in London was able to telegraph members of the British Army in America, no need to travel to India to put down the mutiny, it's already been sorted. They were planning to ship troops to India, which of course would have taken 10 or 12 weeks and would have cost £60,000. They avoided that. So government, that persuaded governments even more that this was a smart thing to have backed, and didn't they do the right thing? But, there's always a but, on September the 18th, it stopped working. It went silent. Now they'd had problems with this, no new technology ever works perfectly, and they'd been doing a lot of resending of messages because signals were getting lost and whatever. So it wasn't as smooth. And when they said, oh, we've had a message from the Queen, well, they did, but it might have had to be sent half a dozen times before it all arrived in sufficiently understandable bits to put it together. This caused huge problems in America, and Field even came under a lot of criticism. The company was accused of fraud. You know, this cable never worked. It was fake news. But Field he consulted with everyone that he could. Some of the cable was still working when they split it up, and some of the other cables that had been put around the rest of the world were still working, so the basic technology was okay. But what was needed was a lot more science and some engineering. So the government set up a committee of inquiry, British government, and committees of inquiry in the UK have a good track record. It was a committee of inquiry that looked at the sinking of the Titanic and concluded lifeboats was the answer to this. So there's a good track record of appointing quality people to committees of inquiry and letting them do the job. There were 4 members from the Board of Trade, 4 from the cable company, and they all were recognized, respected people. Now, to give you an idea of the sort of person on this committee of inquiry, this is an interesting question. Any mathematicians here? Don't volunteer. This was a question posed to a 10-year-old child prodigy. Okay. And do you want to know the answer? And he worked it out in his head. And what's really interesting about this character is that he could explain how in his head he did it. A lot of people who have this mathematical ability can say, yes, I saw the answer, but they can't tell you how they got there. And this chap could. And this is he. Distinguished engineer, and his work influences psychologists to this day. And together with others, this is what they looked at. Why did it fail? And they came up with the first electrical definitions of things, and these names now we all know. And this was the first case of the scientific community recognizing members of the scientific community in naming different things. And the conclusion was that it might well have averted a war if it had worked, so we've got to persevere with it. And for sure, it can be done because we understand more of the science now and more of the engineering. And one of the solutions to this problem of laying the cable, oh, don't do this to me. Never appear with animals. Oh, I've just lost a stone. Was the Great Eastern. The biggest ship by miles at that point ever built, and for decades afterwards, the biggest ship ever built. Right. It was a commercial disaster. It was built for $500,000. It's on its third owner by now, who'd bought it for £25,000. Nobody wanted it. Couldn't find a use for it. It was commercially disastrous. Well, yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. Never appear with technology, animals, and children. Can't avoid this one. And they were so desperate for something to do with it. It killed Brunel, of course, building this thing. But he'd met Field and had said to Field, this is the boat to lay your cable, by the way. Then he hopped off and died. But they said, the then owner said, well, you can have it. Won't charge you any money for it. Just, I'll settle for some shares in the cable company, in the Telegraph company. So back they go, raise some money, and away we go. And this is the Great Eastern in the bay in Newfoundland, which was the American end of where the cable came ashore. And to get the cable from the ship to the shore, they just had a line of rowing boats, and they passed the cable over the back, and then from one boat to another until it hit the shore, and then they pulled it ashore. A lot of manual effort in this. And in 1865, they set off. This in addition to the crew, of course. And the 2,500 miles of cable, because the Great Eastern's capable of carrying the lot. And they've got to feed themselves along the way. This is before refrigerators, obviously. That's of the Prince of Wales at the time. At Sheerness, he's visiting. It was that there was a huge amount of public interest in all of this. And again, it took a huge team of men, weeks and weeks, to get the cable aboard the ship and to get it in properly. And that's what it looks like. And this is what it looks like. This is it. This is a section of that cable. When I gave this talk to my Rotary Club in Port Talbot, and I'd finished, Idris Roberts, sitting in the audience, said, I've got a piece of that. And here it is. Have a look at it afterwards. It's quite heavy. This is the shore end. So it's got an extra layer of metal insulation and other insulation around it, because waves bashing on it are going to do a lot of damage otherwise. But once you get into deep water, then the only bit you need is this bit. And it's surprisingly heavy. Anyway, that's Valentia Bay today. That's the Irish end where the cable goes off to America. 600 miles to go. The cable snapped. The braking mechanism failed. And that was that. They couldn't then go back and retrieve all the cable, obviously. There was only 600 miles to go, so there was 2,000 miles of the cable in the water. And they couldn't retrieve it, so they packed in for the winter and returned to base. But he was not daunted by this. And in 1866, he raises yet more capital, because his investors still believe him, government still believe him. He's got a new cable, and off he goes. And this time, everything works. And not only did it laying the new cable worked, they were able to retrieve the one they lost the previous year, pull it up, connect it, and so they ended up with 2 cables going into America. And at this point, the world sensibly goes nuts. Baronetcies, gold medals. He was christened Lord Cable, even though he couldn't be made one. They were building and decorating the Senate building at the time, the Capitol building in Washington. And the cable is celebrated in that. This is the ceiling, the dome, the inside of the domed ceiling. And if you look in detail, there's the cable. Venus is holding the cable. It just happened to coincide with the painter being up there. And somebody says, cable's working. Oh, put it in. And this was the result. Colossal financial reward. And what happens in these things is when new technology comes out, the price is high. As more and more technology is produced or more use is made of it, the price comes down, more people use it, and the revenue goes up. And that's exactly what happened here. And this technology led to the formation of Reuters, Wall Street, being able to get in touch with London and so on, UPI, the press, United Press Agency. And the Great Eastern is now busy as crazy laying cables all over the place. It's really having its heyday. And within 10 years, this is the cable network across the Atlantic and elsewhere, connecting South America, Africa, they're all over the place. Cyrus did live to see this, but he died in 1892 of modest means by this point, because he had made some rather unwise investments a little later on after making a huge amount of money out of this. But modest circumstances for him would be better than modest circumstances for most, I think. And by 1902, we've connected Australia, New Zealand, the whole world is connected by this point. And in 1914, the day war was declared, we pulled up the German cables and cut them. Because we knew where they were. And of course, they probably knew where ours were as well, but they weren't smart enough to get at it. So that was painted rather late in his life. And this all happened because this mild-mannered man got hooked by this passion and was not prepared to take no for an answer. He was absolutely convinced that it could be done, it should be done, and that he had the credibility, the stubbornness, the obstinacy to actually make it happen. And he certainly did that. So in my view, he's a giant. And it's a long time after this. This was 1868. The first transatlantic telephone cable wasn't laid until 1926. And it wasn't until 1927 that ordinary people could pick up a telephone and make a transatlantic telephone call if they were prepared to shell out, don't know what it was at the time, probably many pounds a minute to make a transatlantic telephone call, which you also had to book. And we owe it, a lot of it, to this man. Thank you for listening.
Forgive me.
Surprise, surprise.
Wonderfully clear, as always, Geoff. Absolute
Thank
pleasure
you.
Whenever we hear you talk. It's an absolute joy. Could you fill us in a little bit about, I have these romantic ideas of how the cable was actually laid at the bottom. Is it just free at the bottom of the ocean, or in fact, is there some structure, engineering structure, which holds them in place?
No, it relies just on its weight. And if you you pick up this, you'll realize just how heavy it is. There's nothing to disturb it, so you might just lie it on the seabed. It has risks associated with it, as if you're crossing like the English Channel, that if you're in a place where people are regularly dropping anchors, that's dangerous for the cable, because if it gets snagged and it's pulled up.
There's never been any concerns about well, breaks. In fact, haven't actually occurred. There haven't been any.
Not by natural causes, and it's not going to get snagged by in the middle. You know, most of the crossing of the Atlantic, it's in shallower water. And where it comes ashore. So I think where they come ashore now in Wales and in Ireland, they're probably buried in the sand some distance and then come up just to stop people messing about. Probably. But it's a security worry for governments because it is exposed and it's easy to track because it's metal. So with any metal detectors on ships and ships technology these days, I should think that anyone who wanted to know where these cables were could plot them quite easily and then do who knows what. And the worry for governments, of course, is that think how important this might be. Like when we cut the German cables, okay, well, we'd like to isolate the UK. Let's go in the English Channel and out in the Atlantic and cut the cables. Now the satellite technology is one defense against that, but it's as anything physical offers a risk, and I think that's a worry that we ought to have.
Thanks. Can you tell us who actually owns all the cables? Are they owned by governments or companies? And can anyone actually lay one, supposing they've got the dosh to do it?
Dosh, that's a financial term I hadn't heard before.
Oh, you're obviously not as rich as me.
These cables were owned by the limited company that Field and his investors formed. And a lot of the cable that exists today is owned by Telegraph companies, names like AT&T and Bell, people who were in it originally. But there's no reason, as far as I know, there's nothing to stop anyone. I think it's probably one of the few things you don't need planning permission for, is to lay a cable. You might need planning permission for the building on land to connect it to, probably would, because it's likely to be of a reasonable size. But whoever's prepared to invest, I can't imagine they're doing it much now. And anyway, now the cables would be fiber optic, they'd just be glass. So they'd be much lighter, much cheaper, and massively faster. This, comparatively, sending a signal down this is probably a millionth slower than sending something down a piece of glass, a glass fiber, perhaps even more.
Wonderful technology, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yeah, I should say.
Did the team of scientists work out why the cable ceased to work?
I'm sure they did, David, but I tried to stay non-technical in this for two reasons. One is I don't understand it, and the other is it's too technical. Martin Patton would grasp it in no time, and the chaps in the science group. I started reading up on it, and I thought, there's no way I can explain this to anybody. But I think there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with the copper or the installation, but making that length of copper cable, and when you see it's 6 strands that are sort of coiled around, a bit like electrical cable at home. It's not an individual wire mostly, it's a wire that's coiled or whatever it's called, spun. All it needs is for one of those wires to break, and you lose some signal. When one of the cables, when it was first laid and it stopped, they just backed up the boat a bit, and in backing up the boat and taking the pressure off it and then moving forward again, it worked. So they think that perhaps the cable had done that, and then when they put it back in the sand, it just reconnected. So it was a very immature technology then, but you think how manufacturing has improved over the last 150 years of this sort of stuff, and some of the stuff we can make today, and how primitive that was. It was a huge achievement, I think, to make 2,500 tons of cable like that, of copper, insulation, and steel cable, a wire around it to protect it. It's a heck of an achievement.
Right. Right, I'm particularly interested in this because my father brought me up. He lived in Birkenhead, and we used to hear stories about the way the Great Eastern was used to lay the first transatlantic cable. Tell me, it was tremendous. They had to gut it inside, obviously, because she was a total disaster as a commercial enterprise for a transatlantic liner. But did they manage to get the whole of length of a cable inside the hull of the Great Eastern, or is there a junction halfway across the Atlantic now?
No, one single cable. Got it all on board.
They managed. They gutted it inside, so that was a feat in itself. Was persuading it all to have room inside, but they managed to get it all inside the hull of the Great Eastern. I shall go home having learnt something. Thank you very much.
I have as well. We talked over lunch, and if you remember the picture of the Great Eastern, it had 6 masts. And David was telling me that they were named Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, because there was no Sunday at sea. It was just another day.
Is that it? Anybody else got any questions? Yeah.
Could you tell me where gutta purchase comes from, please, and how long a tree would take to grow?
I don't know how long they take to grow. It comes from much the same place as rubber, around Malaysia, that part of Asia, where that sort of climate it needs to grow in. And because it was a British colony, we had the monopoly. But they're quite big trees. I mean, think back to that illustration. So I imagine they take a fair amount of time to grow. But we're not short of golf balls, are we?
Oh, thanks once again to Geoff for an amazing talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.